I are going to be moderating today's seminar on behalf of RemPlex, which is the Center for Remediation of Complex Sites. And RemPlex was established at PNNL a few years ago to create a forum for sharing knowledge and promoting collaboration in the area of environmental remediation. And we host a series of different events throughout the year. We'll put a link to the RemPlex website in our chat, and at that website you can learn more about RemPlex and also get access to relevant information about the remediation of complex sites. For your information, we will be recording this seminar, and that recording will be made available on our website probably in the next day or so, along with copies of all of the presentations today. And from that same website, you can look back at previous recordings from RemPlex seminars from the past, as well as other information. So today's seminar is going to focus on the topic of incorporating climate resiliency into remedial design and implementation. And we have four presenters. If I can get my slide to advance. We have four presenters today talking about different aspects of this issue. The first is Eric Mielbrecht, who is directing scientist and co-founder of EcoAdapt, and he'll be talking about the future isn't what it used to be, implications of climate change in contaminated site remediation. Then we have Rajiv Prasad, who is a senior research scientist here at PNNL, talking about extrapolating national and regional climate science to the site-specific level. And then Jason Nguyen, who is a site manager with the DOE Office of Legacy Management, and Zexuan Xu, a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And they'll jointly be presenting about climate resiliency planning being conducted by U.S. Department of Energy for their legacy sites. Nick, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen, for this brief introduction. My name is Nick Shafoku. As Karen said, together with Karen, we will moderate today's seminar. We are very excited about it. The first speaker that we have today, as Karen mentioned, is Eric Mielbrecht. He is a directing scientist and co-founder of EcoAdapt, a nonprofit research group which has one important goal, creating a robust future in the face of climate change. He began practical study of the fate and effects of contaminants at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and has worked with agencies, organizations, universities, and companies from the Florida Keys to remote Pacific Islands. We are very excited to have Eric today, and his presentation is titled, "The Future Isn't What It Used to Be, Implications of Climate Change in Contaminated Site Remediation." Eric, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You can hear me and see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me set up presentation here. Okay, that should work. And then, oops, that's the wrong screen. You know, it always works really well when you do it in practice.
That is so true.
That's interesting. It's not. Let's see. Are you seeing my presentation? Or are you seeing a blank screen?
There, we're seeing it now.
Now we are seeing the presentation.
Thank you.
Great. Good. Sorry about that. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for certainly the opportunity to speak today. This is a topic that's dear to my heart and has been for several decades. And I'm hopefully can share some excitement that is emerging, I think, in this field, and certainly the progress that's emerging in this field in the last 5 years or so. That's built on, I think, some good thinking, obviously, before that. You've already heard a little bit about me. EcoAdapt, as was mentioned, is a small nonprofit research group based in the Seattle area, and we focus just on climate change adaptation. We've been around for about 13, 14 years, led by some of the earliest thinkers in implementing climate change adaptation into everything in society and science as we can. We've had clients, big clients like the U.S. Forest Service, who's managing forests over hundreds of years and wanting to integrate climate change into their thinking and long-term planning. Also work with small clients like small municipalities, like on Bainbridge Island, where I am right now in the Puget Sound, who is a small city trying to manage this change and get a handle of what the future may look like. What I'm going to start from is what you might call kind of a chaotic beginning. The media has done a good job in the last decade or so, kind of highlighting these kind of chaotic disasters, which we've been desperately trying to respond to and kind of clean up afterwards. The goal of my presentation is to convince you that we are certainly can shift and need to shift from more kind of this chaotic understanding and response to more of a managed and scientific and strategic approach to anticipating these risks and making sure they don't happen in the first place. We've been doing this in managing sites for decades in a strong and resilient and risk managed way, and we certainly can do it with climate change around that. Just a quick reminder, obviously, the goal of remediation and site cleanup is to protect human health and the environment. We all know that. I think it's good and central to kind of think about that. I'm going to today focus on three kind of major topics in and around that. One is expanding the conceptual site model idea. Just a quick review, traditionally a conceptual site model has been a written or illustrative representation of the site conditions and the physical, chemical, and biological processes that control the transport, migration, and potential impacts of contamination to human ecological receptors. Very much a textbook definition, but hopefully I want to expand that a little bit so we can think about things more broadly and proactively. Within that are the second kind of component of my presentation is going to be about around sustainable, resilient remediation and some of the ideas and guidances emerging there, which I think is perfect in supporting the management of risk in sites with climate change. And this kind of third idea, last but not least, that triple bottom line of environmental, social, and economic components in site management and remediation, which is I think, very important and maybe a little underserved in the past. I love Yogi Berra. He has many quotes out there. This is one we use at EcoAdapt often. The idea that future ain't what it used to be. I kind of changed it a little bit for the title of the talk. But really, we're trying to look forward now as we begin to think about managing sites instead of looking into the past or historic data to inform the future. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of modeling information and results and findings around climate change. Subsequent presentations by my colleagues here will go into more detail as they bring those down to site-specific challenges. My goal is to kind of show you a quick overview and kind of introduce you and provide a context for the subsequent talks. So this first idea of expanding the conceptual site model is and kind of expanding and thinking more broadly, temporally, to include climate change, and also more broadly, kind of physically beyond the site boundaries. And I'm going to touch upon some of the key climate change kind of history, data, and future projections from mostly the 4th National Climate Assessment from 2017. Just so you know, the fifth National Climate Assessment is in the works, was stalled a bit, but I think we should start seeing products from that emerging later this year. And I know that the Pacific Northwest National Lab has many scientists actually involved in that process. So it's kind of fun to see this come full circle. Some agencies are obviously releasing results in a more timely manner. Some of the results I'm sharing here, especially on sea level rise and storm surges, are from a NOAA report that was released just earlier this year. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the actual numbers around the different climate change parameters I'm sharing here. They're here for you to look at. Usually the future is shown in kind of the next 30 years and the next 80-year increments. Obviously, sea level rise is continuing to rise, and it's a significant issue. Extreme events, king tides and storm surges on top of that add to those risks. Some of the terminology we use in reports now are this kind of like moderately damaging or typically damaging flooding. We're going to see that occurring more than 10 times as often toward the end of the century than we have in the past. So these are significant things to think about. And I think when you're managing sites, it's more thinking about long-term changes, but also managing those extremes, those kind of edges of the bell curves in which systems still have to function and also protect society and the environment. Also touch upon some of the challenges to site management that climate change impacts may be bringing. Obviously, with sea level rise, we'll see erosion over longer term, episodically, site inundation and salinity changes, and surface waters, receiving waters, groundwater hydrological changes, salinity gradient changes, plume dynamic changes, transport changes, et cetera, especially in embayments and other nearshore areas. Also need to keep in mind that changing ecological kind of context in which we're managing toxicity. If there's communities and populations in which we're managing toxicity for and receiving waters, for example, maybe shifting, we need to think about how we might want to be changing and managing the release of permitted toxins, et cetera. And extreme events, scouring, extreme flooding events, wind damage to site infrastructure, et cetera, during kind of, hurricane events, et cetera, all things we need to be thinking about. Precipitation, another one, certainly has been increasing kind of gradually. Precipitation is harder to get a handle on with models. Generally, in the future, it'll be wetter, become wetter in wet areas and drier in currently dry areas. It's wetter, especially the Northeast and Alaska, and then drier in the Southwest. Shift in precipitation type from snow type fall events to more rain events as things warm up over time. Stream events, and you can define them many different ways, are certainly going to be increasing into the future, especially in the Northeast, maybe 2 to 3 times the number of stream events. So the kind of things to think about as you're driving kind of resilient parameters into engineered solutions and or other remedies. Precipitation has a lot of effect on obviously surface water, groundwater, soil moisture content, et cetera. Groundwater
Hey, Eric. Nick, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I can't hear anymore, Eric.
Okay.
Eric, can you hear us, please? Oh,
It looks like he may have dropped and will reconnect.
Yeah, he's reconnecting as we speak, so.
Okay. Dang.
I was checking my computer, making sure that I was
I know, I thought
connected.
for sure it was me. We'll give him a minute to catch back up. Kelly, can you see if he's trying to get back in?
The waiting room's open, so he should be able to pop right back in, and I do not see his name.
Okay, I'm just gonna, I'll just text him and see what's going on.
Just send a message saying that his internet connection went down.
Oh no. Well then, I think maybe we should, Rajiv, are you still with us?
I'm here.
Okay. If you want to go with your talk, and Nick, maybe give an intro for Rajiv, and we'll hope that Eric can rejoin us at the
Yeah,
back end.
I think that is a reasonable pathway forward.
Okay, I'm going to let you do that, and I'll try calling Eric and let him know we're doing that. Okay.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Rajiv Prasad is a senior research scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. He has over 20 years of experience in applying surface water hydrology concepts, developing conceptual and simulation models, assessing impacts of climate change, and applying simulation models to address issues related to flood hazards and assessment, flood forecasting, water resources planning, and environmental analysis. And Rajiv will speak today about extrapolating national and regional climate science to the site-specific level. Go ahead, Rajiv. It's a great pleasure to have you today here.
Thank you, Nick. Let's see if I can share my screen, and then we'll go from there. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. You are good to go.
Okay, great. So Nick already introduced this topic, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. Let's see if I can move to the next slide. So Eric started talking about this. The question here is really for remediation site and contaminated sites, what you need to do is really get to decision-making that has to be local, really at this site scale that you need to understand how climate change is going to affect you. And these site-specific hazards that can impact the resiliency of the contaminated site and the remediation measures that you take are changing. And they're changing because they're influenced by global scale climate. Eric was just about to show you some figures where it was pretty evident that the climate change impacts are not uniform across regions. So across regions of the US, you see differences. Now, this is something that the US Global Change Research Program documents in their National Climate Assessment reports. The current one is NCA4 that Eric was talking about. NCA5 is supposed to come out in about 2023, and we'll see how it works. But in the between NCA4 and NCA5, they're using the same 10 regions that I can tell. So the regions are shown on the map over on your right. NCA5 is expanding the discussion of climate change to include some additional topics. But the ones that are sort of relevant or more relevant to contaminated sites include the ones that I listed here. And again, just to make the point that any decision you want to make for these complex sites must be made at the local scale. So there is a hierarchy of spatial scales here. Global change modeling or climate change modeling takes into account really the large global scale processes. From there, you want to get down to regional scales. And then depending on where your site is situated, you might want to get to watershed scale and then down to local scale. So I'll try to walk you through some of that. Here are some of the indicators that the USGS GCRP compiles in terms of providing the climate change information. So climate change affects what? Those are the indicators that they talk about. So temperatures, and then different aspects of temperatures like heat waves or heating and cooling degree days and things like that. On the precipitation side, there is changes in mean precipitation they talk about. They also talk about heavy precipitation, and heavy precipitation is defined differently in climate science than what we would do on flood assessments. They are mostly like 95th percentile or 99th percentile or something like that. They also look at Western US snowpacks, how that might be changing. So there is a lot of these indicators that you can get information from the national climate assessments. Let me talk a little bit about what we have been doing. This project was funded by NRC Research, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And during the five years that we worked on this, we produced 4 reports. In year 1, there was this national scope report that we did. Year 2, 3, and 4 focused on different regions of the US because of 2 reasons. One I mentioned before, is that region to region, the effect of climate change and the impacts are different. Number 2, that the nuclear power plants for which this assessment was done are scattered around the country, but mostly are located in those regions that we wanted to look at. Now, these reports are all published and they are actually available on OSTI, DOE's report repository. And once you get these slides, those are actually links that you can click on and get to those reports. Now, these, the map on your right shows you in different sort of an overall context, what are some of the issues that affect different regions. So in the Midwest, you might look at mesoscale convective systems, convective hazardous weather, lake effect snowstorms, heat waves and droughts, and things like those. In coastal areas, obviously, you have to look at sea level rise being a major concern. And then depending on where your site is, what else might affect that particular site. So I'll give you some examples from the work that we did for the NRC. And again, going back, these reports were compiled from the point of view of informing what climate change might mean to different nuclear power plants. Again, the same issue existed there, that nuclear power plants, when you want to look at hazards at those plants, they have to be very, very site specific, and climate change information, particularly the ones that USGS GCRP reports on, are at a regional level. So how do you get there? That's an outstanding question that I'll talk about a little. Here are some examples. In the Midwest US, future extreme precipitation changes are depicted here from a study by Nguyen and Hamlet in 2018. In the middle panel, you see precipitation changes during summer, and on the right side, you see during winter. And there are these changes that seem to happen on a regional scale. These are all sort of reported at the regional scale. Going forward, this second example is about a little bit more of relevance in the sense that these are projected changes in mesoscale convective storm systems. And the insight here is that the frequency of these systems might be increasing. That is sort of indicator of how temperature changes might affect the instability in the atmosphere. So you get more of these systems develop and then maybe impact your site. At the same time, MCSs have been determined to be moving slower. If they move slower, then they're likely to sit at one location longer and may be able to produce more rain or precipitation at your site. So if you see here, the current storm composite from this Pine et al. Paper shows what under current climate, what a MCS simulation looks like, and in a future storm, what it might look like. So you see the storms are generally bigger, and they produce greater amounts of precipitation. And this has direct impact on if you're sitting near one of these storms, what can it do in terms of hazards at your site? Another example from Midwestern US, this analysis was done to look at frequency and magnitude changes in floods, but using observed data sets. So what we know about the changes in the magnitude and frequency of floods over the Midwestern US with 50 years worth of record. So the study by Malakpur and Pierini basically used over 700 USGS streamflow gauges, looked at the record. On the left panel, you see the flood magnitude and changes depicted with the blue up upward pointing arrows, that is the positive trend in magnitude of flood. And then the red arrows that are pointing downwards, those are negative trends. So if you look at the left panel versus the right panel, the magnitude of floods, there are a lot of gray dots, and those are basically saying that they did not find any trend or any statistically significant trends at those locations. There is a bit of clustering between the blue and the red locations, so negative and positive trends, but they're quite intermixed with the gray dots. On the right-hand panel, though, they found that the increasing trend in the frequency of flood has been increasing, and that sort of happens pretty much all over the Midwestern US. So this was one of their determinations, that maybe the flood magnitude itself could have more local impacts in terms of how much of a flood you see, but the frequency increases. So that has a direct impact on your remediation measures, or how frequently you might want to go in and see if your remedial design or the way you're protecting that design and keeping it functional has a greater amount of risk or not. Another example here from Midwestern US, this is projected changes in floods. So what the US Army Corps of Engineers did is basically looked at the watershed. So now we are going from global scale to regional scale, that was the previous slide, to a watershed scale. So they looked at Red River of the North, particularly at the Fargo, North Dakota location, where they wanted to see what would be any change in flood frequency curve if you wanted to see what climate change would do to the hydroclimatology of that watershed. So they necessarily, what they did, they put together a watershed model, and then they used climate information to perturb future climate by creating 90 daily long-term daily data sets that were used to drive the flood model. And then the flood model itself was used to do pretty straightforward flood frequency analysis. And then each of these curves is basically selected from runs that represent the peak flood magnitude in history, so 1950 to 1999 median flows, and how that frequency curve looks. And then the blue, green, and the red ones show you the different time periods when when projected floods are supposed to happen. And what you see is that the curves are lying above the historical curve. What that means is that the flood magnitude changes, and also, in other words, the frequency of a particular given flood is going to increase. And that is depicted by basically a point on the dotted line here is basically shifting back. So it's becoming more frequent when you go to the red or the green or the blue curve. Now, one thing to note is that this particular plot is on a log scale. So even little changes here are quite a bit. They did compile a table of what the annual exceedance probability, how much they might be changing. So from the baseline, for these 3 periods, you see these median changes. And these percentages are quite a bit. So at a site-specific scale, the regional analysis, if you remember the previous slide, told us that the flood magnitude may not be changing that much, but the frequency is changing. Now, when you project it using climate change information, you see that these percentages are not that insignificant. We are seeing changes up to about 35%. That is quite a bit in terms of flood discharge. And that discharge translates into how high your flood level gets, and then what sort of a risk it poses to a particular site. So this is one example of how you can do a watershed level analysis and then look at a particular location on your stream if your site is located there. Another example I'll show here is from the northeastern US, and this is looking at, and Eric was mentioning this also, seasonality changes. So how, because of changes in the temperature regimes, how snow-dominated catchments can go from snow to rain on snow, or even rainfall-dominated flood regimes. So this is a study from 2010, looked at changes in hydrology of tributaries to the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. They used 3 GCMs and 2 scenarios. This is a little bit older study, but they did create 18 future hydrologic simulations. And what they started looking at was for different subbasins. A is actually the St. Francois Basin here in green. You see the winter to spring mean temperature differences. So this is when this trend actually crosses the 0 line here. That is when you see the snow dominating, which is basically the site has been, or the watershed has been in the past, changing from snow over to rain on snow, right about in the first couple of decades of the 21st century, and then continuing that trend in the later part of the century. So what that means is that we are going to see more and more rain-dominated floods here, and they are going to be faster because the snow storage is going to be significantly smaller in these watersheds. The same thing is shown over here. Winters to spring snow to precipitation ratios are going to be decreasing because you don't get as much snowfall. Okay, so we are again staying at the watershed scale for now. I'll show you some things that we have been doing recently that looks at site-specific hazards. This is again a flood study funded by NRC Research. We are still working on it. We hope to be completed by the end of this fiscal year. But this is to create predictive models of site-scale hazards, again, for nuclear power plants, but looking at how floods can be affecting that site in a probabilistic sense. So what we do is we look at a probabilistic driver, in this case, precipitation, and using flood models, we change that probabilistic precipitation behavior into probabilistic, in this case, flood elevations. So for any annual exceedance probability, and the more you go on the right side of this diagram, the rarer the flood. And that's why the flood depths keep increasing. As you go to the left, there are more frequent floods. So 10 to minus 1, I don't know if you can read it or not, it's pretty small, but 10 to minus 1 means that 1 in 10 chance that that flood happens on an annual basis. So this predictive modeling we are putting together. We have been doing high performance computing to be able to construct what these are called hazard curves. And in this case, the particular hazard is the flood elevation. And the idea here would be that you take what you know about precipitation changes, so that is what this delta S presents, and then bring it into your probabilistic precipitation characterization, and then drive your flood modeling to be able to predict not only what happens today with your precipitation probabilistically represented in today's climate to what it might happen in future climate. So that is work that can be done. And this is one example of trying to connect what you know about regional changes in climate through a local scale modeling into predicting hazards that might affect your site. So I'll stop there with some summaries that I can just state from the work that we did for NRC. Changes in sea level obviously affect coastal sites. They can combine with changes in tropical and extratropical storms, as well as if you're on a site that has both say, riverine discharge. At the same time, you have coastal settings, then you may be able to, or you should be able to look at both of those things. It also goes back to not only on-surface changes, but groundwater changes too. Changes in air temperature, and Eric was showing some of those slides, so I did not point that out to you. But air temperature changes are variable across the US, and they get particularly relevant to flood modeling when you go to northern climates. Changes in mesoscale convective storms can result in greater precipitation and may increase your flood risk. Seasonality of snowmelt can affect both the magnitude and timing of the flood, and that might be one change to the site-specific hazard. So the point that I wanted to make is that hazards must be estimated at the site scale, and that necessarily for challenging site becomes even more complicated, because not only you are trying to develop a site scale model and to try to drive it, but also depending on how challenging your site is in terms of what contaminant you're trying to manage. You may need to look at very long time periods over which your remedial solutions have to be resilient. And also very rare events may need to be considered, because the rarer the event gets, the higher its potential for causing vulnerability at your site, and that might result in really severe impacts to human health and the environment. So I'll stop there and see if we can address questions later.
Thank you, Rajiv. We did have one quick question, and perhaps the answer isn't quick, but it came from Stuart Arm, and he asked if the projections you're presenting account for any climate change mitigation.
Okay, so I have a question back. Do you mean about these?
It came up when you were showing the flood change projections on slide 7 and 8.
Slide 7 and 8. Yes, these explicitly account for changes in, well, this one doesn't, because this looks at the history of record and what we have been observing over the 50 years worth of record in the Midwest based on stream flow measurements. So think of them as historical trend that might be used to characterize the trend in what has been happening over the region. The second, this particular slide is actually a flood modeling based update to flood frequencies, and that the 3 solid curves here in different colors, they actually are constructed from explicitly accounting for what would happen in that watershed in terms of climate change and how the flood frequency then might change. So yeah, they are a mix.
Good, thank you. I think in the interest of time, Eric, if you're with us now in stable connection, we'd like to switch back to your talk. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great. Can you hear me and see me?
We can hear you, and go ahead.
Okay, I'll do a screen share and get that going again.
Great.
Hold on, hopefully pick up where I left off.
And hey, don't sweat it that happened. We know that stuff happens.
It's inevitable, I guess.
I'm sorry it had to happen to you, but there you are.
It does happen. Well, thank you for the audience for going with the flow here, and thank you for Rajiv just stepping in when I was unceremoniously just kind of yanked from the stage. I was going to talk a little bit more about temperature and a couple other climate parameters, climate change parameters, but I think Rajiv went over those in some detail already. So I will skip forward a little bit. I'm happy to address questions as we get to the discussion in the panel. People are more curious, but a couple other components kind of related to climate change and are I think relevant to site management. Understanding risk. I mean, wildfires, obviously a big one, especially in the Western United States. Trends have been increasing in the past and are projected to increase with kind of drought and soil moisture decreasing with warming temperatures in general. Of course, wildfire is certainly responsible for catastrophic impact at sites, spread of contaminants through kind of volatilization of heat and combustion, and then severe damage to site infrastructure. So it's something that is being considered more and more so. One that's a larger change, but I think significant, are kind of the changes of the chemistry and water bodies around sites, the receding waters, et cetera, and host to obviously the ecological communities in which we're trying to manage toxicity for in many cases. The data we have are for open ocean, and right now at the end of the century, we see another 0.3 in a decrease of pH unit anticipated, which is significant. These are changes we haven't seen in tens of millions of years. Of course, pH is a driver of changing speciation of different chemicals and toxicity of chemicals and systems. Certainly a stress on species, marine species for sure, and a change of the ecological communities, again, as we're managing toxicity for. In coastal and nearshore waters, pH changes are quite variable. It's driven a lot by kind of influx of fresh water in close proximity to sites, and also kind of the upwelling that may be occurring seasonally and more consistently, and kind of geological and mineral compositions, nearshore formations kind of affect that. So there's quite a bit of local variability there, but something to keep in mind. A big variable out there that I think is beginning to be considered a little more appropriately as we look at ideas of like maladaptation and kind of conflicting interests and responses is that human response to climate change. It is anticipated there will be some increased use of some chemicals. For example, pesticides used to manage invasive species and kind of agriculture and forest settings, managing disease vectors in human communities. So more runoff, more kind of toxic load in receiving waters potentially around sites. Also potential use of more fertilizers supporting a longer growing season in agricultural areas. So a lot of things to consider. And I will go forward to kind of my goal of my talk, and I think these talks are together, is that we can get a really good handle on these changes at a localized level, as Rajiv was very nicely illustrating. And we're shifting from this idea of kind of uncertainty and chaotic response to more of an anticipated and managed risk that's informed by systematic vulnerability assessment, and in kind of building a resilience of our remedies in place. And things that will need to be considered, because a lot of our cleanup these days is kind of based on a risk model, and the efficacy of what we have learned from in the past of those kind of different responses and remedies is certainly going to change. A lot of sites now are managed with contaminants may be managed on site, either with engineering or institutional type controls or land use restrictions. Engineering controls include hydrologic control, source containment, kind of passive treatment, monitoring, and natural attenuation, all part of these things. And they're based on a continuum of data that we've learned from and can project forward. But now we certainly have to integrate climate into those to make sure they still function as we initially anticipated. Legal responsibility is another question out there. CERCLA court cases to date certainly are indicating that liable parties can face additional liability going into the future as climate change may be undermining remedies that have been thought to be robust going into the future. So it's not a kind of wash your hands and walk away type situation. Liable parties will have to maintain control of those sites into the future and anticipate climate. So we're shifting into this idea of informed adaptation, moving toward much more resilient and sustainable risk management through systematic vulnerability assessment approaches using downscale data to the watershed level, to regional level, so you can really kind of anticipate those rare and extreme events, which may be pushing design parameters. Plus those gradual changes, which give you an idea over time. You don't have to do all these responses immediately and improvements in resilience immediately, but you can kind of stage them in a very systematic way. Something I'd also like to emphasize that precaution and a factor of safety is essential. The models are only as good as they are, and understanding uncertainties in models is key. We've also seen that society is not doing a great job of mitigating greenhouse gases. And so all those conservative futures we've seen, we seem to be exceeding them quite well. So when we think of climate change, think of kind of those upper curves of risk. I do want to put on the table this idea, another one of my key points of this talk is that sustainable and resilient remediation is something that is really, become an exciting field of study and understanding in the last 5 years or so. There's a lot of, the problem has been clearly identified, and emphasized, and prioritized. For example, the GAO report of EPA sites in 2019. Yeah, this is something we need to deal with, and we need to focus our attention on that. We certainly are. There's been collected information that's coming together, guidance that's coming together, best management practices that are beginning to emerge, case studies of successes and failures. Example, regulatory and policy frameworks are all emerging kind of at the federal, but more at the state and local levels that we can all learn from. And I'll talk a little bit about those in my next slide. Standards are emerging. ASTM has put the standard guide for remedial action, resiliency, and climate impacts together. Professional societies are beginning to put this more front and center. For example, the Sustainable Remediation Forum certainly has resilient remediation as one of its components of its mission, and is a great place to accelerate exchange of ideas and learning. States are stepping out to lead and learn. In the last few years, the state of Washington, for example, Department of Ecology has put out some guidance. Others, New Jersey, California, I know many others are beginning to do that. Beginning to take those small steps in the right direction from which we can learn and lead the way that others can certainly learn from. So a couple examples here of what is emerging out there. If you haven't stumbled across these already, but ITRC Sustainable Resilient Remediation Guidance document was updated in 2021. This is a large collaborative process involving regulatory agencies, management agencies at the state level, private sector, academia, etc. And really is a good kind of review of good examples out there. As I was saying earlier, state and federal regulations are summarized in these policy and guidance resources that can be used and learned from and built upon. It really advances these ideas about social economic dimensions of remediation. Good guidance about integrating resilience and sustainability into the remediation life cycle. These are standard practices in which the resilience is being injected into in important ways. But I think it's interesting to me, and most I think relevant, are the best management practices that are tested and turning out to be reliable are becoming gathered into one place as a resource to pull from, and good case studies and examples are available. Another example is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They put out in 2017 the adaptation strategies for resilient cleanup remedies. This is really kind of a state-specific interpretation of risk given the policies and regulations that exist within the state. So really had strong guidance around assessing vulnerability and building that into a cleanup process. Really good steps and tools and data and resources and case studies for informing processes within the state of Washington. And there's similar guidances emerging across the country right now. My final point is really to kind of emphasize this idea of expanding the conceptual model to be more broad than just environmental protection, but really emphasize society, the economy of the communities around those sites, and the equity and justice as those processes continue. So it's really putting cleanup in a broader perspective, and maybe a perspective that was lacking by extending that conceptual site model to the surrounding communities' environments. And it's really enhancing the equitable inclusion and awareness of overburdened communities and making sure they're front and center. Putting social and economic costs and benefits on equal footing with environmental costs and benefits, of course. And really kind of championing the idea of community benefit and ownership through stakeholder engagement. And then throughout the project life cycle, extending these ideas and changes, improvements into future site use, future ownership of that site, and of course, future available funding around the management of a site if it's a long-term management situation. Also want to emphasize this idea that augmenting Western scientific approaches by integrating local knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge is key. It really emphasized community involvement by acknowledging community sensitivities and values, and kind of realizing that diversity of revitalization benefit is key, and all perspectives are a part of that. So a couple examples for this, and that's going to be it for my presentation today. Again, the ITRC document had a good emphasis and kind of dissection of what are called hidden benefits of remediation. So these are beyond where just benefiting the environment, but where the social economic benefits are also included and are derived more from the choices made in the process of the cleanup project, in addition to, but distinct from, the protectiveness of the remedy itself. So this idea is that benefits or hidden benefits are to help improve the overall livability of that location for the community around them, the human community around it. These can be emphasized or realized through reduced energy consumption and improved air quality through use of efficient technologies and renewable energy and engineered remediation and remediation actions. Improving the community resilience and building that into the idea of the site and its remediation. So obviously direct health and safety improvements through cleanup, but often you'll see indirect health improvements where community is more encouraged to go outside in an area that may be more aesthetically pleasing in its restoration state, and the environment generally improved. Considering economic vitality as part of remediation, engaging local vendors and local sources for materials and workers in the cleanup process and long-term management is key. And as you're beginning to bring this idea of improved resilience in a remediation process to that society, this is a community that'll be better able to respond to stresses like extreme weather events, et cetera, if they're generally overall healthier and happier and that better resourced. At the state level, an example of kind of this triple bottom line of society, economy, environment is emphasized in New Jersey through their Office of Environmental Justice. And an example here is these supplemental environmental projects. And one is one at the Waterfront South Rain Gardens location. And these are examples of taking a remediation process to site just one small step farther. Obviously, they were going to cap and probably landscape a site after the remediation occurred. This is an old gas station location where they pulled out, I think, a dozen or so underground tanks and removed a lot of soil. So what they did for this site with the community involvement and emphasis is they moved the final kind of landscaping work into forming a rain garden that was able to help manage quite a bit of localized flooding that occurred in the region. And so it had a multiple benefit, also had some paths and signage and put in place to make it more of a community location. So it's an idea of taking remediation a couple steps farther, small investment of money, good investment in community relationships and involvement. And this is a good example where probably that identification of local flooding was brought to the attention of a process by community members who lived there and noticed it over time. Oops. So that's kind of the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time and look forward to the panel discussion.
Great talk, great presentation, Eric. There is one question though that came in the chat, is related to the, when we were discussing about the effect of different climate change variables on soil properties. I believe you mentioned the effect on pH, and the question that Natalie is asking is, why will the pH change? If you have any insight on that.
Okay. Well, in open oceans, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but a vast majority of the carbon dioxide producing through anthropogenic greenhouse gas production is being absorbed into the oceans. And due to chemical changes in the ocean, absorption of that carbon dioxide actually is increasing the hydrogen ion content of the ocean. and decreasing the BH over time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. And I remotely have been involved in some studies that are looking even at the changes in the pH in soils, actually, as a result of the increase in the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which right now is around 420 parts per million, which is really, you know, the highest has ever been since a couple of years back. So, all right, well, thanks again. And Karen, do you want to take it over from here?
Sure, I will. Thank you, Eric. And we have a third presentation. It's a joint presentation on climate resiliency planning for the U.S. Department of Energy legacy sites. And it's jointly presented by Jason Nguyen, who is a site manager with DOE's Office of Legacy Management. And that office is tasked with a long-term stewardship for post-closure sites within DOE. Jason has 10 years of experience improving site remedies, evaluating risk, and maintaining regulatory compliance. And then he's presenting with Zexuan Xu, who is a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley, has interdisciplinary training in environmental science, climate science, data science, and software engineering, and is working on developing tools and software to support climate resilience data processing and analysis. I will turn it over to Jason and Zexuan.
Thanks, Karen. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, and our timeline has been all messed up, so please just go ahead and take time with your presentation.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thanks for that intro. Zexuan, maybe let's go to the next slide. So just wanted to kind of start this talk by talking briefly, and Karen kind of just alluded to it as well, a little bit about kind of who legacy management is. And basically kind of the gist of it is we're the kind of long-term steward for Department of Energy's contaminated sites. So there's another office within Department of Energy that kind of does a lot of the big earth moving remediation work, and then legacy management is tasked with maintaining these remedies into perpetuity and ensuring that the protection of human health and the environment isn't compromised. So yeah, this slide just kind of shows our mission statement and the goals that I thought were kind of relevant to the discussion at hand today. Next slide. So this is a map that kind of shows the kind of breadth of mission that LM has across the US. So it's kind of busy, and probably hard to see on the computer, but I think it kind of gives you a sense for the scale of the problem that we have to address when we're trying to evaluate climate risk to our program. So the different colors basically denote different levels of effort that is related to the site, and then the different symbols kind of show the different regulatory regimes associated with that particular contaminated site. Next slide. So as far as what's driving this work, I think kind of the most important one is this last bullet here. Just kind of given the long-term mission of LM, I think it behooves us to understand an evolving long-term threat like climate change. And so I think that at its core is why we should be and are looking at this issue. But then there's kind of these other two bullets are kind of more administrative. They're being driven by executive orders coming down from ultimately the president's office and then flowing down through DOE. And then there was a GA report specifically about LM that kind of touched on climate issues as well. And so those confluence of all those drivers is really why we're pursuing this effort. Next slide, please. On this slide, I just wanted to kind of give people a flavor for the types of things that we're trying to protect when we're trying to assess climate risk to our sites. So in addition to kind of a big geographic area, there's just a lot of different types of assets and infrastructure that we manage and maintain. So yeah, these photos just kind of give you a flavor. The photos and lists give you a flavor for that. So yeah, next slide, please. And so kind of the message here being, in addition to the broad geographic range, we also have a lot of different things we need to protect. And so kind of trying to wrap our arms around that is where we decided to pull in Lawrence Berkeley, and Zexuan will kind of be taking it over from here and kind of giving you a sneak peek, I guess, of how we're trying to assess that climate vulnerability and ultimately bring in potential vulnerability or potential resilience measures. All right, take it over, Zexuan.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Thanks for everyone. So here I'm going to talk about an overview of the Berkeley Lab's approach to work together with legacy management for screening the climate resilience at all RM sites. So basically, the first step, we establish an interactive approach between the climate science and institutional knowledge across the legacy management sites. So we did everything along with DOE and the EPA's established guidelines, and I think this is the first national level screening of the climate risk with a focus on soil and groundwater contamination, like Jason already mentioned. And we developed a comprehensive survey to the RM site, which I will going to talk about in the next few slides, to understand the assets and concerns from the site managers and collect previous institutional knowledge and identify the priority sites. And also in the later part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about the analysis of historical climate and the historical and projection climate data sets, which is consistent with the US GCRP National Climate Assessment Dataset. And we also developed the open source Python toolkits to complete the transparency from data to visualization, and also the capability to leverage as more data and information are acquired. So that's an overview. And this is the institutional knowledge we collected from the site managers, and the figure on the left showing a sample of the survey we sent out to the LM site manager last year. We designed this survey with questions to collect institutional knowledge about from the site managers about their perspective on climate risks to their own site. We think the survey is pretty successful with 141 responses in 3 weeks, including all the LM sites and 26 sites to be transferred to LM by 2026. And many of the responses are actually from the admin sites, and also like on the lower round table figure here, we kind of see like more than 20% of the admin side think they have some possible climate impacts to their site. So that's has a kind of good lessons to learn from the site managers. And this is just, I'm not able to talk about all the answers we got from the site, so only a few here. So this is a question about the site features that are vulnerable to climate impacts or climate extremes. From the site managers' answers, as you can see, like the top 3 features, like site managers think are vulnerable to climate impacts are disposal cell, site access road, and groundwater contamination. And we also did this, we have the analysis for all the sites, and we also have the analysis like split by different regions as defined by the National Climate Assessment Report. So you can kind of see like in different regions, the response are kind of different. Some region like in Southwestern US, people are always, which has the most RM sites, site managers are more concerned about the disposal there. And for like Midwest, they might have more concern about like something else, like groundwater remediation system. So that's one example. And the other example in this question, we directly ask, which climate disturbances do you consider to have the potential impacts to long-term performance? So from the response, I think we identify like the top two disturbances are like erosion and intense precipitation, which are of course very closely related to each other. So like this is the lessons learned from the site manager that like intense precipitation or extreme precipitation, erosion are kind of the most concern for most of the RM sites. And some additional survey results in terms of intense precipitation impacts, we do dive deeper into the response and ask them like what's a specific damages or concerns they have in terms of intense precipitation. Like many of the site manager response that the like damage to critical site infrastructure, relates to contaminants, or like damage to remediation systems are their major concern. And there are some other like specific identified concerns or institutional knowledge being mentioned by the site managers that we think are useful. I'm not able to talk all of them, but just give you a sense of the survey we had done. And then we also developed the workflow for assess the climate risk for LM sites. So this is a workflow. On the left, we developed the tool with Google Earth Engine to automate the downloading of climate data at waste management waste site. We are able to download the CMAP global climate model data and also like ERA5 reanalysis climate data sets, which are all available on Google Earth Engine. And on the right, we developed the notebook in Python to do the data analytics, calculating the climate matrix and generate visualization and come up with vulnerability ranking. And also we are able to integrate with some machine learning models to compute the vulnerability probabilities. So that's a workflow we developed in this task. And everything is open source, like I mentioned. So feel free to check out this website on PyPy. We developed the package called Climate Resilience. And as you can see, these are the screenshots on the website. We have some example codes to download and pre-process the data. We're able to generate different kind of visualizations, including like map view or like the box plot view for different regions. And we also have a very detailed explanation or comments of the functions that we use or created in this Python packages. So feel free to check out if you're interested. I think I can safely skip the technical details of these slides, given that the previous presenters have introduced. But the key point here is that we use a refined resolution downscale climate data sets derived from the GCMs under CMAP5, which are the same as the data set used for US GCRP and the fourth National Climate Assessment Tool. So we are consistent with the federal requirement for this climate resilience assessment. And then I'm going to go through a few screening results that we have done for all RM sites. So this is annual average temperature results for all the sites. So the left figure is the historical average from 1950 to 2006. And the cutoff time 2006 is just a definition of CMAP5. The two figures on the right showing the projection the projection periods average under different scenarios. RCP 4.5, which assume that everything is like business as normal, and RCP 8.5 is kind of considered as the worst scenarios in climate projection. So you can kind of see like, of course, we are expecting the like increasing temperature or higher in temperature in the future, and the Tmax daily maximum temperature projection in RCP 8.5 is much higher than RCP 4.5 here in almost all the sites. And one important thing I want to highlight is we clearly see the variability within each region, like the outlines on the black lines here. So that indicate that the site level assessment is kind of important in addition to like the regional scale assessments. So we really need to select the priority site and dive deeper into those sites and know the climate resilience specifically for those sites. So that's results of average temperature, and this is a similar structure but for annual total precipitation, and we can kind of see like the on the left here, total precipitation is like relatively dry in most of the southwestern US sites, and weather in like northwest side. And in RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, we are seeing like different patterns regionally, like in west, but mostly in the projection, we are seeing like increasing precipitation in most of the sites, except those sites in New Mexico and Texas. But generally speaking, if you still, you can probably remember those precipitation changes are like about 10 to 5%, so relatively minor, not significant. So this is annual total precipitation. But if we look at extreme precipitation, which we just saw from the survey or institutional knowledge, like those site managers believe like intense precipitation are the major concern. So this is a key climate variables we look at from our data analysis. And here we use the EPA definition of extreme precipitation events or extreme precipitation days, defined as the days with precipitation in the top 1% of all days that having the recordable precipitation. So this is showing the changes of RCP 8.5 against the historicals. I'm showing the percentage change on the figure, on the left figure. And if you still recall, like the previous slides, like the total annual precipitation only increased like 5 to 10%, showing in the previous slides. So this change of extreme precipitation is significantly greater than annual average precipitation. And also on the right, we are seeing like the numbers of days, the numbers of extreme precipitation days changes significantly. Like some sites can even double the numbers of extreme precipitation days. So I think the take home here is we are expecting a higher frequency of extreme precipitation days and higher probability of intense precipitation in the future. And that's aligned with the concerns from the site managers about the erosion and intense precipitation impacts. So that's really something we need to pay attention in our climate assessment. So addition to those data sets, we are also got able to evaluate the drought index. So there are a lot of drought index available. So here we selected SPEI, which is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index. And we also use an external data set from our collaborators from Florida Institute of Technologies to grab their data sets. So basically, this is a long-term index to take into account both precipitation and potential evapotranspiration in determining the drought. And this is a long-term climatology information. So basically, and the value indicate like the value is standardized and dimensionless, and the negative value means like it's projected drier. So this figure is just a screenshot I grabbed from NOAA. This is the most recent analysis of most recent results of the CONA scale drought severity index. So we are kind of seeing like the Western US experiencing drought, while the Eastern US is doing fine. So we are able to analyze the long-term SPEI index for all LM sites. And this is the results in different projection scenarios, RCP 2.5 and RCP 8.5. So basically, I think the conclusion we observe from those plots is concurrent with the conclusion that Eric just mentioned, like the wet region is getting wetter and dry regions is getting drier. I think this is kind of the conclusion we learned from many climate science community as well. And for SPEI, and we clearly see like RCP 8.5, the worst scenarios is kind of drier than RCP 2.6 scenarios on the left, and showing like we might have a more severe drought condition in the like RCP 8.5 scenarios. So that's the drought index we have observed. And also we're able to look at the wildfire, which is one of the important concerns, right, rise from the site managers. So the left figure is the burn area over the recent 5 decades. And the LM sites are shown as stars on the map, and many of them are close to the historical burned area, particularly in the southwestern US. And we collaborate with Argonne National Lab to analyze the wildfire index over CONUS. And in this case, we use the index called Canadian Forest Fire Weather Index, CFWI. I'm plotting here, which is the most widely used index for wildfire. And this map on the right shows the index value for 50 years return interval, 50-year return period wildfire events. And the Z-score here for each LM site is showing the shift from historical to projection periods over the LM sites, overall LM sites. So we are kind of seeing many of the LM sites in southwestern is kind of showing increasing a higher chance of wildfire in the future. So this is some preliminary results we are doing in terms of wildfire frequency. So I think this is my last slide before the summary. And this is just give you a sense of the capability of our tools, climate tool, to provide aggregated climate data sets for individual sites that we hand off to the site managers and the legacy management office and other stakeholders for their other applications or other usage of our data sets. So this is just an example of the standardized data sets we hand off and provide it to the site managers. We also have generates time series visualizations for the site. This is the example of the Mexican hat in Utah, and we created like the mean value of historical periods, the standard deviation of historical periods, and also like the mean and maximum value for different climate projection scenarios. And we are also able to calculate the changes from historical to the projection using the Z-score value, like some statistic calculations that we can help the site managers to see how much changes from the historical to the projection. So I think I'm probably running over time, but this is the summary of our presentation. So we are able to develop the toolkits to download and downscale the CMAP data to support the climate resilience assessment. And also with the institutional knowledge, we are able to use the packages we developed to assess the risk of flood, drought, and erosion, as well as wildfire for legacy management. Particularly, this toolkit has been extended to support other applications like the variability assessment report required by the DOE environmental management sites, which is another office that Jason mentions. And I think our tool is applicable to be used for other sites and for different purposes. So if you're interested, or if your site are interested, feel free to check out the tool we developed, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zexuan and Jason. Nick, do you want to go to any questions before I get into a few announcements?
Sure. What do you think, Karen? We have about 9 minutes left in our scheduled time. I did have a question for Eric, though, that I thought it was going to be really good if he would be willing to address. What do you think would be helpful now for agencies and practitioners managing contaminated sites who are struggling to adapt to climate change, Eric? So how would you address that question?
That's a big question, and I think a lot of agencies are beginning to think and even consider this among the many other challenges they're dealing with about managing sites, is how do we integrate climate into that? And I think some of the bits that I touched upon are the examples that are out there that are being tried, and the ones that work are for adaptation strategies about how do you build resilience into systems, engineered systems, approaches on institutional controls, et cetera, that seem to be working and being resilient. So if we can amplify those and spread those as quickly as possible for their implementation, I think it's helpful. And I also think that having policy examples and an exchange of good regulatory frameworks to be kind of amplified throughout the state agencies would be very helpful.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Eric. And I don't know, Karen, do we want to continue with one or more?
Well, we got a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see from, I'll read it out. So it's from Amy Fitzgerald, who's with the City of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Based on your very informative research, what recommendations might you give to decision makers who are currently evaluating waste acceptance criteria for on-site waste disposal? And I'm not sure, Eric, is that something you can speak to?
I think I can start a conversation. I think it's this idea of a more systematic understanding of what the vulnerabilities would be about maintaining that waste on site are key. And I think a lot of the kind of downscaled climate information that all the presenters shared today are super helpful to understand what the future may be when you're trying to manage those contaminants on site. I don't have specific recommendations, and those are the kinds of recommendations I think and context and questions that I think a lot of regulators are struggling with. And as I mentioned before, is how can we collectively learn and share ideas around these really complicated decisions? It'd be most helpful. But yeah, please, any of the presenters, I'm sure, can bring more detail to that.
Yeah, I can add to that a little bit. I think one of the things that decision makers would really benefit from are tools like Jason and Zexuan were just illustrating. I mean, one of the big things for any site manager is to be having access to site-specific data. And I think those tools go a long way towards getting there. One thing that I still don't see is a sort of a agreement on how that data should be used to do your own site-specific assessments. And I think that's a big gap that still exists out there. Once you put those two things together, so get the relevant data that applies to you, and then your own institutional knowledge to be able to use in a site-specific assessment tool to look at what vulnerabilities you might have to what you're trying to do, I think is the way to go. But for better or worse, I think for worse, every site and every location does it like a one-off assessment. And I think providing some uniformity there would be really nice.
Well, I want to turn to the tool that you talked about, Zexuan, and talking about its applicability at other sites. Can you expand upon that, how it might be useful for other organizations, other sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we already, in our toolkits, we're already building the pipeline to download the data sets. I think everyone could just take that and download and process the data set by their own. But additionally, we are able, I already presented the way that we use external data sets to I think other site managers or other sites could just use whatever the data sets they are interested or they feel they're comfortable to use and run our toolkits with their own data sets to analyze whatever they want in terms of assessing the climate risk. And also one additional item that we are currently developing is the bias correction using the site measurements, meteorological measurements at the site or any kind of measurements that are available near the site, because we all use model data and it has bias. So it needs to be corrected or correct by the observational data sets. So I think that's a very useful tools to the site managers to better have a better understanding of the data sets they have, and probably more useful when they extend this climate projection in their decision-making strategies. So I think that's a few applications that we already have and we are currently developing in our toolkit.
Okay, great. I have a question. I've been struggling exactly how I want to form it, but I think Jason at DOE, you may have an answer to this, and Eric, it gets specifically to some of the things you talked about, which are the need to factor in the social dynamics, the economic piece, and to consider equity issues related to remediation in general. And of course, climate change is queuing itself up to impact disadvantaged communities disproportionately more than others. And now we have remediation needing to, consider those equity issues as we look at the design. Can you expand upon how that is achieved? I mean, what do you think is the path forward to making sure we're actually incorporating those social dynamic issues? Methods, process, any response on that? Like I said, I wasn't sure how to ask it, so it may be really hard to answer.
Want to give it a go, Jason?
Go ahead, Eric.
I'll give it a try.
Yeah.
And it's a really important question to be asking. And I put it in the context of EcoAdapt's work over the last 10, 15 years or so. We're seeing climate change present an opportunity to step back and reassess situations, which maybe not have been good in the past and way decisions have been made, and step back into those decisions. Let's say you've got a site that has a remedy in place that's being managed, and that decision was done 20 years ago. But climate change is now giving an opportunity to go back to a site and reassess vulnerabilities, but also broaden that discussion to include the community, to include community values, to look at maybe a better longer-term use of that site and land management. And that opportunity is great because it gives you an opportunity to bring in a larger conversation, improve upon a situation, and make sure equity and justice are upfront, and involvement and community involvement is upfront in a process. So that's that. When it's complicated, there are opportunities, but you have to be willing to step up to the challenge.
Okay, Jason, I know you guys have a very strong stakeholder engagement program. Is this something that you see ahead of you to wrestle with?
Yeah, I think it is. And I know it's this kind of whole climate change and risk and resilience piece is something that our stakeholders are also really interested in. And so, yeah, I think just kind of continuing to engage them on these topics as we learn more as we go through this process with Lawrence Berkeley, I think is part of it too. But like Eric was mentioning, a lot of these remedies have been in place. We're kind of tasked with maintaining them, or if they're not going to be sufficient for the future, we may have an opportunity to improve them. So yeah, just kind of keeping those issues in mind, I think will be important going forward for sure.
Well, I appreciate those answers. I know that's a tough question, and we're right at the hour, and unfortunately, technology challenges caused us to lose a little bit of time, but I appreciate the speakers sticking with it and very much enjoyed the presentations. Related to that last question and answers, I just wanted to let everyone know that the IAEA's Network on Environmental Management and Remediation is hosting a webinar on Tuesday. It'll be at 2 p.m. Central Europe time, and it's on multi-criteria decision aid tools in environmental remediation. And it will be talking about multi-criteria decision analysis tool developed actually by Karlsruhe Institute in Germany that can be used to try to balance some of those various dimensions related to environmental remediation. So I'll put a link to the registration if you want more information. That'll be in the chat. And before we completely close, I wanted to say that our next RemPlex seminar is going to be held sometime in late July, and it's going to focus on risk-based environmental remediation decision-making. So a cousin sort of to some of this topic that we've been talking about. And again, I want to thank everyone. Nick, closing remarks from you?
Just to remind everyone that all the seminars that we have had in the past, and this one included, are recorded and will be actually uploaded in our website, in the RemPlex website. Thanks again for everybody for attending today. And thanks again for the speakers. We had a fantastic set of speakers today.
Yes, we did. Thank you. And I see Kelly has put a link to a survey in our chat too. So if you have time to fill out the survey, we'd appreciate the feedback. And thank you again, everybody. We'll see you in late July. Take care.
Thanks again.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.